Hello, good evening. Welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. This evening, we're going to be discussing the importance of standing up to racism and apartheid, and also looking at the impact of the police crime sentencing and courts bill and what impact that will actually have on our ability to actually protest on those matters. I'm really pleased to be joined this evening by Tony Greenstein, who many of our viewers will be well familiar with, but he has a very impressive CV. He's a lifelong socialist and anti-imperialist campaigner. He's a prolific blogger. I think many people have read his blogs, and he's campaigned against apartheid virtually all his adult life. In fact, from the age of 16, he was involved in the campaign against the South African Springbok rugby tour in, I think that was the late 60s, actually. So that gives you an idea about Tony's age. Tony's also a co-founder of the Brighton and Hove Anti-Fascist Committee and was a secretary of the local anti-Nazi League in the 1980s. And he's the vice president of the Brighton Hove Trades Council. People also probably be aware that Tony was one of the first high-profile members of the Labour Party to be expelled after being accused as part of the phony anti-Semitism campaign. But I wanted to start this evening just asking Tony to talk us through a really impressive demonstration that took place against that police and crime bill in Brighton at the weekend. I think Tony was anticipating a fairly modest crowd of 200 or 300 people, but it turned out to be several thousand people, which is pretty significant, I think. And it demonstrates, I think, that there is a real palpable sense of anger at the government's proposals to substantially restrict our ability to engage in peaceful protest, with the threat, frankly, of criminalizing it with huge fines and potentially up to 10 years in prison. Indeed, those people who took down the statue of the slave trader in Bristol would indeed be potentially facing a 10-year prison sentence now, if indeed this bill goes through and those similar actions were to be taken in the future. So let's just get Tony on the screen now then, and perhaps Tony, if you could just talk us through that demonstration on Saturday, what happened, and I believe that you spoke at the meeting as well. So just take us through what happened.
Yeah, well, I just caught an announcement on my email that there was a gathering against the police and crime bill at the level, which has been the historic scene of labour movement mobilisations and places where we've driven the fascists off as well. And I was quite stunned to see all these people streaming towards it. It was clearly in the thousands, not the hundreds. And I joined my comrades with the Trades Council. And after there was a number of speakers, Black Lives Matter, essentially, from what I could gather. I'm still not aware of exactly who coordinated it, and it was suggested that I should speak about my experiences having just been released from Her Majesty's accommodation in Birmingham as a result of an action against the Nelbit factory there. And it was quite surreal, really, because I started, and about 30 seconds into my oration, as it were, the mic was suddenly cut when people behind the scenes, as it were, decided that I shouldn't speak. One woman, speaking to the others, described me as an anti-Semite. Being Jewish, of course. I mean, that's a natural label that comes to mind. But I'd already announced to the crowd that I'd been just released from prison because I'd helped to try and redecorate Elbit's factories, and the crowd grew increasingly restive and angry. They wanted to hear what I had to say. In the end, the people at the back, having said it wasn't an open mic and so on, relented because they really didn't want to get the crowd and the march against them, as it were. So I did speak, and I made all the points, and I finished with the quote of Nelson Mandela that Israel was an apartheid state, and we would not be free until the Palestinians are free. So it was and also, I mean, I began by saying, let's face it, the police are our enemy. They represent the state. They represent everything that we are opposed to. And we can be under no illusions as to what the police and crime bill is about.
What do you make, Tony, of the what do you make, Tony, of the way in which the sort of pro-Zionist movement have really upped the ante over the last sort of few years since Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party? I mean, you're a veteran campaigner, a veteran anti-imperialist, a veteran pro-Palestinian campaigner. How does this compare with their activities of, say, a decade ago?
Well, that's right. I mean, the Zionist movement has started, if you like, to get its act together on a grassroots level, because I think Israel was stunned in 2005 when the Boycott National Committee came into being and there was a call for BDS. BDS struck at the heart of the Zionist project of Israel. I mean, they could take criticisms, motions being passed at union general meetings and so on, but this was something concrete. This meant that people were serious, just as boycott, divestment and sanctions, when that was adopted against South Africa, then the end of the road was clear. And Israel has devoted enormous resources and time and energy to combating it. In America, it's done its best to make it illegal. And various state legislatures have outlawed it and made, for instance, your contract as a teacher depends on you opposing BDS, that kind of thing. And France, likewise, the Constitutional Court outlawed it until the European Court of Human Rights basically overturned it. So the Zionist movement since 2005 has started to get its act together. And that really came to a head with the election of Jeremy Corbyn. The idea that a supporter of the Palestinians could become a leader of the second major party in Britain was just unacceptable. Not just to the Zionists, of course, the United States and British intelligence, likewise. The idea of someone who'd been part of the enemy within, as it were, someone who's been on the record as opposing NATO, opposing nuclear weapons and so on, despite the pacifistic nature of Corbyn's politics, he represented to them a threat to everything that they value dearly. So we saw what was really a state-sponsored campaign, I have no doubt about that, alleging anti-Semitism. And I was the first, but not the last Jewish person to be expelled. And we see today, I mean, dozens of Jewish people are being suspended and expelled for anti-Semitism. I mean, that's the crazy nature of it. I mean, it's clear to anyone. You mention Israel in a derogatory way or critical way, you're out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, right. I mean, Zionism isn't a fascist movement, but it's working in many ways like the fascists at the grassroots to try, you know, in the Labour Party and elsewhere, to try and combat its opponents. And one manifestation of that was at the demonstration on Saturday in Brighton. As I say, I mean, I quite easily overcame it, but it's indicative of the fact that Zionists will often lend their support in verbally to Black Lives Matter as a way of negating support for the Palestinians.
What do you think explains why people who would have been opposed very strenuously to apartheid in South Africa seem to have a blind spot when it comes to Israel and Palestine? I mean, is it because of fear, or is it a blind spot, or do they not realize the brutality and the reality of the Israeli regime and the daily life, the daily indignities for the Palestinian people? How do you explain it, Tony? Because to me, it seems a bit of a conundrum, really, that, you know, particularly the Labour Party has been leading this charge against, well, people like yourself and many others. I mean, obviously, as you know, I'm similarly, you know, a victim of those appalling allegations, partly because I stood up for people like yourself and said these people are long-standing anti-racist. How dare you label them and smear them in that way? And then obviously they went for me in the end. But how do you explain that, though? What I mean, that blind spot that seems to exist with so many people inside the Labour Party, and indeed other political parties as well. It's interesting. I know that Caroline Lucas, I think you blogged about it, actually blocked, which was a welcome step, I think, from the Green Party, who were looking to basically oppose, as I understand it, the IHRA examples of anti-Semitism. But she found a way, Caroline Lucas, of preventing that vote from taking place. But again, you know, it seems odd because she would have been, I think, one of those individuals actually being around at the time of apartheid in South Africa when it was at its height, who would have been, you know, on the front of the demonstrations, you know, opposing that, and yet they seem to be very silent when it comes to Israel. How do you explain that, Tony?
Well, there isn't one simple explanation. I mean, let us not forget, historically, the Labour Party was also a party of the British Empire. And it was a party which connived in and supported, in essence, the colour bar in South Africa. I mean, it supported the Boers. I mean, that was considered a radical position, actually, to support the Boers in the Boer War, for example. So for a very long period, apart from elements in the movement for colonial liberation, I think we're getting a bit of interference, but that's okay, I'll continue. The Labour Party was never an anti-imperialist party. Indeed, it could be argued the Attlee government super exploited the colonies in order to pay for reforms at home, the National Health Service and so on. Remember, in 1945, when Attlee came into power, they were bankrupt. They had to have a $3 billion loan from the United States. And you can imagine what that's worth today. So Malayan rubber, super exploited. They launched a counterinsurgency war in Malaya. They did very much the same in Africa. So, I mean, the Labour Party and also the trade unions, it has to be said, were never naturally opposed to apartheid. It was only really after Sharpsville and the massacre of 69 black African protesters that the Labour Party started to fall into line. But I can remember in 1969-70 when I was on the streets as a 16-year-old opposing the rugby tour of the Springbok tour of Britain. I mean, James Callaghan condemned us for the usual excuses and said we should go home and so on. So, I mean, there was still that element in the Labour Party that didn't really want to take it on board. And if you remember, the BBC used to broadcast the South African cricket tour right up to the 70s. So, I mean, it was really only in the 1970s, and you remember Peter Hain was the organizer in his radical days of those demonstrations, that people began to wake up. But why South Africa and not Israel? Well, I guess that South Africa is a black and white, or was a black and white issue. They had signs, whites only, blacks only, just like in the Deep South. Israel doesn't have petty apartheid. It doesn't have in Israel proper. In the occupied territories, there are roads for Jewish settlers and there are dust roads for Palestinians. But even there, they don't have signs saying it. The army enforces it, but they don't give you a propaganda possibility. They don't put up the signs Jews only because they know what would happen and that people would draw the conclusion. So for many people in the Labour movement and the Labour Party and others on the left, it's been very difficult to grasp that Israel is an apartheid society. It doesn't have the signs that say you are forbidden to walk here because you are Palestinian. But what you will have is in places like Safed and elsewhere, the chief rabbi ruling by edict that Jews must not rent property to Arabs. It's not written into law. It's not. There's no signs on the lampposts, but that is what people do. So if you're an Arab, you will find it impossible to rent there. Likewise, I mean, it's not at first obvious to visitors to Israel that Arabs the vast majority live in their own towns, which are constricted from expanding. There's been no new Arab town in the history of 70 years of Israel's existence. There's been hundreds of Jewish communities which have been created in that time. So there is a regular demolition of Arab properties which don't have a building permit. I mean, this is a continuing saw. And then you look at some of these Arab towns, they're literally surrounded on all sides by Jewish settlement. And in the Jewish nation states law, it says that one of the virtues, one of the positive things of life is Jewish settlement. What that means is no Arab settlement. Or you have a 93% of the land owned and controlled by the Jewish National Fund, whose aim is to redeem the land for the Jewish people, quote unquote. All of this is not necessarily obvious, but it's becoming obvious, because even B'Tselem, which is Israel's main human rights organization, formed in 1989 as a liberal Zionist organization, not an anti-Zionist organization, reluctantly came to a conclusion, and they issued a statement, a very, very good statement, in January of this year, which said that Israel was now an apartheid state, from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, the old slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. That is the reality. And they said there is an administration, a regime of Jewish supremacy throughout that area. It differs in different parts of Greater Israel, but the overriding principle is one of Jewish supremacy. And Jewish supremacy is apartheid in anything but name.
Let me say to our viewers as well, anybody who wants to participate in the discussion can do so, but you'll just need to make sure that you tuned in to the YouTube link, because unfortunately we can't see any comments on the other platforms that we're streaming on this evening. But just continuing with that point though, Tony, about that kind of blind spot that seems to exist in, liberals and people inside the Labour Party. It's a curious state of affairs, isn't it? That the very people who are pride themselves on being strong anti-racist organisations like Hope Not Hate, for example, an organisation which seems to be kind of leading the charge on the issue of this bogus anti-Semitism campaign. Indeed, they run a smear campaign against me in the run up to the last general election. I mean, it just seems really it's like a real conundrum. How is it that anti-racist organisations are actually seemingly in favour of another form of racism? And perhaps it's difficult for you, perhaps, to ask you to explain why that. What is their thinking? But what's your recipe for how we kind of challenge that and how we, alert people to the realities of what's happening, and why is people like you and I, stand up so strongly against the abuses of the Israeli state?
Well, Hope Not Hate, and before it, the Searchlight magazine, the anti-fascist magazine, were both, if you like, sympathetic, supportive of Israel and Zionism. And they deliberately ignored Israel's connections with fascist regimes. I mean, you have the situation whereby Israel is supplying weaponry for the Azov battalion in the Ukraine, which is a neo-Nazi militia whose members deny that there was ever a Holocaust. Israel is seen, and this is obviously part of the problem, Israel is seen as the compensation to Jewry for what happened in the Holocaust. And everything is subsumed by that. In reality, of course, Zionist relations with Nazi Germany at the time were, in essence, ones of collaboration. Zionism was always accepted, and people have to understand this. Zionism never had a problem with anti-Semitism. Zionism took anti-Semitism as the natural reaction of non-Jews to the Jewish presence in their midst. So you and everyone who's not Jewish had anti-Semitism inherited. It was described as a hereditary disease by Leo Pinsker, the founder of the Lovers of Zion, a hereditary disease. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it was incurable. Now, if a disease is incurable, there's no point in fighting it. You have a palliative, you make the patient comfortable, but it's a futile exercise in trying to combat it. So Zionism's solution to anti-Semitism was to escape from it and to set up their own settler colonial land. Zionism has never fought anti-Semitism. And that is true really today as well. The real anti-Semites, they pay very little attention to. Whereas those of us who oppose what Israel does are classified as anti-Semites. And that's very useful for the imperialists, for American and British and French imperialism, to classify your opponents not as anti-imperialists, not as people opposed to the Western order, but as anti-Semites. It gives you the moral high ground, if you like. So it's a very advantageous. And for Israel, of course, it has a double advantage, because you don't have to defend all your practices. You don't have to defend giving vaccines to one section of the population who are Jewish and not to the other section of the population who are not Jewish, who are Palestinians. So what you do is you attack the messenger and say he's anti-Semitic. But in my experience, there are very, very few, I won't say there are no, but there are very, very few genuine anti-Semites who support the Palestinians. Today, people like Tommy Robinson, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, who told American Jews that Israel is your real home and your real country, and that you're disloyal even, you know, all the tropes that they talk about, they come out with this naturally. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg has been quoted in terms of the attacks on David Miller and others, you know, but Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying that his fellow Jewish conservative MPs, Oliver Letwin and John Bercow, had the touch of the Illuminati about them, which is a secret conspiracy which was wrapped around with anti-Semitic theories and so on. These people are naturally racist, but at the same time, they will accuse people of anti-Semitism. In reality, when a Zionist talks about anti-Semitism, they're not talking about racism. They're talking about political opposition to something. So what they're doing is actually legitimizing anti-Semitism. They're making it respectable. That is the danger of these people.
And Ken Livingstone got expelled from the Labour Party for referencing an historical fact, the Havara agreement, in a discussion with, I think it was on one of the radio with Vanessa Phelps, I believe it was. And he was ironically going on there to express solidarity with Naz Shah, who'd been accused of anti-Semitism. And Ken was, as you'll recall, saying, well, she's not an anti-Semite. I think he said her remarks were over the top, but, you know, make her anti-Semitic. And then he got asked a question about Hitler, and then he referenced the Havara agreement. And then John Mann, as you know, kind of ambushed Ken with a television crew in tow. And the next thing you know, rather than taking action against John Mann's outrageous behaviour, Ken Livingstone was suspended for outlining an historical fact. And it's interesting that Angela Rayner, when Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the Labour Party and she was being interviewed, I'm paraphrasing what she said now, but I think the interviewer put to her, should I say, what Jeremy Corbyn had said, you know, was accurate, as it were. She conceded that it was accurate, but she still said it was unacceptable for him to say it. So, where do you go in that situation, Tony? I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it? And I don't know what you think, but I, in many ways, blame the way in which the Labour Party responded to the anti-Semitism hyperbole and this kind of confected crisis that they conceded to, capitulated to. And I blame that now for it getting completely out of control. I mean, it was always around, as we know, but I mean, you know, the attacks now on academia. I think if there'd been a line drawn in the sand back then, as I and people like yourself, and there was no other parliamentarians, though, because I was the only MP who was saying this, that we have to stand up to this. And you know, it's a very sort of slippery slope that they've actually led us into now, where you know, other people are being outside of the Labour Party being targeted, because I think it's emboldened the kind of Zionist lobby. That's my sense. I don't know what's your take on it, Tony.
Well, my take is, I mean, we're in an Alice in Wonderland situation, aren't we? Whereby something can be true, but it's also anti-Semitic. I mean, I was brought up to believe that if someone was being anti-Semitic, they were talking a load of rubbish. It was complete nonsense. They were living in fantasy land, the idea that Jews are somehow engaged in worldwide conspiracies, or the Nazis' international Jewish conspiracy that Jewish communists and capitalists were both conspiring to destroy the non-Jewish economy in order they take over the states, and so on. And we have that in a different form today with the white replacement theory, that Muslims are being flooded into Europe, in order to destroy the white European nations. And who's behind it? Well, it's the Jews. I mean, that's what Robert Bowers, his head was filled with when he murdered 11 Jewish synagogue worshippers in Pittsburgh a few years ago. He believed that behind the refugee caravan that Trump was lauding were the Jews. And he therefore massacred 11 Jews, the worst massacre in America's history of Jewish people. And what did Israel do? It flew over its education minister, Naftali Bennett, in order to defend Trump from his critics in the Jewish community, because Zionism really does not care. In fact, the leader of the Israeli Labour Party, Avi Gabbay, his advice to the Jews of Pittsburgh and elsewhere was, come to Israel. That's your real home. You don't really belong anyway. In which case, people like Bowers are actually right in what they do. So, I mean, you have all of that. Then you have the Ken Livingstone affair. It's a historical, documented fact, not only Havorah. Havorah is just one episode where the Zionists destroyed the international Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany. There's the whole Kastner affair, which I'm not even sure you will have heard about. A major trial in Israel between 1954 and 58, when the leader of Hungarian Zionism was accused of collaboration with the Nazis. He basically negotiated with Eichmann a train for the leading Zionists, mainly Zionists, but not all Zionists, the leading members of the Jewish community, out of Hungary to Switzerland via Bergen-Belsen. And in exchange, he would not only keep quiet about the deportation trains, but his men would actually reassure Jews getting onto trains to Auschwitz that they were going to somewhere completely different, that they were being resettled in places like Kenya Mays, which doesn't in fact exist. That trial, in 1955, the judge, Benjamin Halevi, reached the verdict that Kastner had sold his soul to the devil. I'm quoting literally. That caused the government, the second Israeli government under Moshe Sharett, to collapse as different parties withdrew their support from the coalition government. It caused a major political crisis. The Israeli Secret Service, via non-official agents, assassinated Kastner soon after. He was too much of a liability to be allowed to live, and that in itself is now being subject to quite searching inquiries, because they believe that the assassins didn't kill him. He was actually killed by Shin Bet in the hospital when he was smothered with a pillow. There are very good reasons from the medical records to believe that he was murdered in the hospital itself. Although the Supreme Court overturned the verdict, in essence, that he collaborated, they did it on legal grounds. They did not upset or overturn the findings of fact of the lower court. Indeed, they said that he was guilty of collaboration and that he gave testimony to a leading Nazi, Kurt Becher. But it later turned out he not only gave testimony in favor of Kurt Becher, which was perhaps understandable, I'll say no more, but he gave testimony in favor of Hermann Krumi, Eichmann's second in command in Hungary, who was in charge of the nuts and bolts of when the trains depart and how they're organized and all of that. A clear war criminal who was only convicted later in Germany when one of the leading anti-Zionist resistance fighters, Rudolf Werber, gave evidence on his behalf. And of course, the heroism of Werber, who escaped from Auschwitz to warn Hungarian Jewry of what was in store to them, was written out of the record by the Zionists. Marek Edelman, the last commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance. No one, he had a state funeral in Poland. He was a hero. But not even the lowliest clerk from the Israeli embassy attended, because he committed a cardinal sin and comparing the Palestinian resistance to the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance. So Zionism rewrites history. And if you dare, like Livingstone, to dip your toe into any aspect of that, you are an anti-Semite. Never mind the fact that in Germany, in 1933, 98% of the German Jewish community was not Zionist. The Zionists were a tiny, tiny handful. Their collaboration, which was undoubted and real, they were the favorite sons of the Gestapo and Heydrich, who was in command of them. that's ignored. It's now assumed that when you say Zionist, you mean Jew, which is itself anti-Semitic.
As we know, probably there are more non-Jewish Zionists in the world, I suspect, than there are Jewish Zionists, maybe. But
it's my greatest regret that Jeremy Corbyn and those around him did not recognise at the first signs that when the Daily Mail and the Jewish Chronicle and all the others start launching the anti-Semitism attacks, that they were not interested in fighting anti-Semitism, but were interested in fighting any manifestation of anti-Zionism and the Palestinians. Corbyn should have stood up when this was taking place and saying, yes, I condemn anti-Semitism, of course I do, but I also condemn those who weaponize anti-Semitism as a means of attacking those who are opposed to the state of Israel and what it does. It was that failure that led to the Zionist attack continuing and increasing. And we know that, I mean, Corbyn was meeting, and his acolytes were meeting Seamus Milne with the Jewish Labour movement. And we know the Jewish Labour movement wasn't a genuine body. It was refounded in 2015. It had been dormant for years. It was refounded, had lots of money pumped in, quite clearly by the embassy, in order to create a wedge inside the Labour Party to remove Corbyn. And that's, in essence, what happened. But throughout that, Corbyn did not recognise it. John McDonnell was worse because he said he was tearing his hair out about the anti-Semitism, which was non-existent. Of course, there are a few anti-Semites in the Labour Party, always have been, always have. I mean, you know, it's like saying because there are a few paedophiles, therefore the Labour Party is overrun by paedophilia.
No, absolutely.
You know, that's
absolutely
nonsense, isn't it? You know?
But what you were suggesting there, though, Tony, that your advice for what Jeremy should have done was precisely what I was doing, and that got me suspended. That was then used as evidence that I was what they described me as a Jew baiter, an absolutely outrageous calumny to throw against somebody who spent their life fighting, racism and actually defending Jewish members of the party, predominantly that were being attacked, and yet that was me being a Jew baiter. But Tony, obviously, the topic of the discussion this evening is standing up to apartheid and racism, and I just wondered how confident you are that we can, encourage and succeed in encouraging the anti-racist movement to embrace the need to challenge Zionism, as a form of racism. I mean, you got a good reception by the sounds of things at the meeting in Brighton at the weekend. I mean, are you confident that we can win people over, people who instinctively ought to be on our side, but for whatever reason, they're maybe not aware or whatever, and so as we've said earlier on in our discussion this evening, there's that kind of blind spot. Do you think there's scope for us to win the anti-racist movement over to the
Yes, I don't think there's any doubt about it. There's always been the kind of professional bourgeois anti-fascists around Searchlight, Hope Not Hate, etc., who have formed an alliance for their own convenience, for financial and other political reasons. You have someone like Ruth Smead, who was deputy director of Hope Not Hate. I mean, quite what that creature was doing at the head of an anti-racist group, God only knows. But the majority of ordinary people, activists, have no difficulty today, I think, understanding that Israel is maintaining a pretty vicious occupation of the West Bank, an occupation which has been described by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Ronnie Casriels and others as worse than anything South Africa did. I mean, South Africa never bombed refugee camps. It didn't bomb from the air Soweto. Israel bombs refugee camps and then drops phosphorus bombs on schools. I mean, you really can't get much worse than that. So to most people, it's clear. It is, I think, quite clear. But clearly, when a mass movement like Black Lives Matter comes about, I mean, sections of the Zionist movement attacked it, like the campaign against anti-Semitism, but other sections tried to win it over by pretending that, well, Israel is not as bad as South Africa was, it's a different kettle of fish and so on. And some people will be susceptible to that kind of propaganda. And also, I mean, you do see sections of Black Lives Matter, I think, retreating into identity politics, which for me is a poisonous form of politics because it equates the oppressor with the oppressed. Everyone has an identity. So how do you distinguish by itself? Identity politics are meaningless.
Adept at utilising identity politics, and that was a very retrograde period. But you, Tony, have described Zionism as just another variant of white supremacism. Could you just perhaps unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Zionism is a movement of Jewish supremacy, but Zionism was also, if you like, the last settler colonial movement in history. It came about at the end of the 19th century. I mean, if it had been much longer, then it would have missed the boat entirely. But the supporters, of course, of Zionism dated back to Cromwell. I mean, non-Jews were far more interested in seeing a return of the Jews to Palestine, or the Holy Land, or whatever they called it, than Jews themselves. Jews were the most resistant to the attractions of Zionism of everyone. It was the anti-Semites. I mean, I have a good quote, which I'll bring up. The British Brothers League, which I don't know whether people have heard about. It was the first proto-fascist organisation in Britain. It was formed in 1901 by the Tory MP for Stepney, William Evans Gordon. And its president was a man named by William Stanley Shaw. And I was perusing the archive of the Jewish Chronicle when I came across a letter that he wrote. And this was it. He said, "I am a firm believer in the Zionist movement, which the British Brothers League will do much incidentally to foster. The return of the Jews to Palestine is one of the most striking signs of the times. All students of prophecy are watching the manifold signs of the times with almost breathless interest." I mean, that was just one example. We see with John Hagee, Christians United for Israel, and so on. But the main supporters of Zionism are evangelical Christians who combine anti-Semitism with Zionism. I mean, John Hagee is the president, and he described in a previous sermon Hitler as God's messenger to the Jews, sent to drive the Jews to Palestine. I mean, that's about as bad as it gets, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's
shocking.
It's part and parcel of it, really.
Shocking. Now then, before I bring in you on, just to kind of get some of the reaction from our audience this evening, Tony, I just wanted you to say a little bit about Elbit Systems, because I know you've been involved with the Palestine Action Campaign to draw attention to Elbit Systems, which is based not in the Midlands, I believe, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what the location is, but perhaps you could just say a bit about Elbit Systems and Palestine Action's campaign. And obviously, you found yourself being arrested for driving a minibus of activists to mount another demonstration against this nefarious organisation, this nefarious company.
Yes, well, Palestine Action is really a kind of group of activists who've grown up over the past few years, mainly because the mainstream Palestine Solidarity campaign is really eschewed direct action. It's been a remarkably ineffective solidarity movement, and Palestine Action has targeted Elbit. Elbit is the largest Israeli arms supplier. It has, I think, 10 factories in Britain, not all of them in the Midlands. I know there's one in Kent. There may be other ones around. And what they've done is they've climbed on the roofs, they've smashed windows, used sledgehammers to destroy what they could. But I think most symbolically, they've taken cans of red paint, which symbolizes the blood of the people their drones have killed, and they've poured it all over the factory. And of course, they've also locked onto the gates, so they've prevented the production of weapons as well by those factories, causing considerable losses to Elbit. Now, the police have mounted what seems to be a major campaign of attack against us, and people have been arrested and charged with conspiracy. And conspiracy charges are, of course, quite serious. I mean, I think you can get a life sentence for it. I'm not expecting to be confined for the rest of my life. But I was driving a minibus. I'd just been rung up. I'm not actually a member. I would say I'm a supporter of Palestine Action, but I was rung up by a friend who said, well, can you drive a minibus with some ladders to get on the roof to Birmingham and then drop off the people at the Shenstone factory, which produces engines for the drones? So I said yes. I had some free time, so I'd be happy to help out. Unfortunately, on our way to the factory, and it may have been by chance, it may have been prior intelligence, I simply don't know, we were stopped and we were all arrested and taken to a holding centre at Oldbury, which I think is near Staffordshire, held for nearly 30 hours, charged. And I was sent with one other person to Wolverhampton Magistrates Court, where we were remanded in custody for a week by a bastard of a magistrate. The other 4 were taken to Birmingham and they got bail immediately. That's the luck of the draw. But anyway, I don't regret it. It's an interesting experience I had for a week. Although I don't necessarily want to repeat it.
No, I'm sure you don't. How was the prison, Tony?
How was
the prison? What were the conditions like there?
Well, I was remarkably surprised because 50 years ago I was remanded in custody, not for this, but for possession of cannabis. I was remanded to Ashford Young Remand Centre, where you had all white warders and black prisoners taken into reception were physically attacked. You know, they were absolute racist bastards. There's no other description. And there were quite a number of violent confrontations there. And it was a pretty bad place. But Winton Green was, you know, I mean, I have criticisms. You could ask warders to do something, prison officers, and they would never do it, or they'd say yes, and it never got done. But the food was certainly okay. It wasn't cordon bleu cuisine, but it was certainly passable, and it was mainly Muslim and black prisoners, and we got on pretty well. I explained, you know, I mean, I had one Muslim guy, you know, built like the brick shit house wall, as they say, who came over to me and sat down and said he wanted to talk about the Holocaust and how terrible it was. You know, I'd already explained to him what I was inside for, and I mean, my reception was perfectly fine, you know, and friendly. I mean, absolutely no problems. I think the major disadvantage of being in prison, which I felt, and I think that's something we need to take up, is that on security grounds, prisoners have no access to the internet or to a mobile phone. And I think in this day and age, to cut people off from the internet is to cut them off from the world as it is. And I think that's got to be taken up. There are security grounds, but they can be overcome. But people should have the right to use what is the world's largest database and not to be kept isolated. Because if you want to rehabilitate people, you have to start from when they're sent down. You can't just do it when they leave the prison gate. So I think that is a major problem.
Well, prison isn't really about rehabilitating people, and frankly, I'd close most, if not all of them, down. I think, I mean, they're a money-making racket now. Many of them have been privatised, although I think Winton Green is in the public sector again.
Came back into the public sector.
But I mean, the vast majority of people absolutely shouldn't be in prison, and maybe those that perhaps ought to be there ought to be held in a different environment, treated as a kind of, as a health issue, medical issue, because it's often kind of mental health issues and things like that. But that's a whole other debate, and we haven't got time for that. But let me now, in the closing moments, just go over to Sean, just to kind of get some reaction. There are many other questions I wanted to put to you, Tony, but the time has beaten us. I'll just get Sean to tell us whether our audience have got any comments or questions for you, Tony.
Yeah.
Oh, good evening, Tony. Great to see a lot of our regulars on the chat this evening. Lots of people obviously interested in what you've had to say, Tony, and obviously your treatment in prison. Well, can we say prison? Holding place?
Yeah,
remand centre. Yeah. But I do have a few questions about the topic tonight. Faraz Khan says, there is a worry in Jewish minds of the threat of the financial conspiracy libel being used to create another Holocaust. Would the panel agree this is a psychological fact and trauma in Jewish minds? And do you distance yourself from it?
Well, obviously, I distance myself from any conspiracy theory involving Jews and money. because there's really no basis for it. But such conspiracy theories come from the right, not the left. I mean, the main archetypal figure in these conspiracy theories is George Soros, who is a liberal American billionaire who was himself a refugee from the Holocaust in Hungary. And, I mean, there have been some vile attacks on him, such as he was a Jewish collaborator. He got out at the age of 13. How you can accuse a young child of being a Nazi collaborator just beggars belief. But people like Glenn Beck on Fox TV in America were propagating this absolute filth. But if people have conspiracy theories, I really don't want to know them, because what's happening in Israel is quite clear to us. You don't need a conspiracy theory to understand the realities of apartheid in Israel today. So just junk all of that nonsense. Deal with what happens. Leave the conspiracy theories to the right. That's their natural home. It's not something that anyone on the left who should have a materialist and class analysis of what's happening should have a problem with. Clearly, Zionism is a powerful movement. It consists of a number of disparate organizations clustered around the World Zionist Organization. There are plenty of conspiracies, but conspiracies do not make a conspiracy theory. I mean, the CIA, what's it there for if not to conspire against the ordinary people and other revolutionary groups in other countries? Of course, you have conspiracies. The Israeli government is engaged in one long conspiracy, but conspiracy theories are a different matter. What it suggests is that a hidden hand of a few people are behind world events, and that is a very dangerous scenario. So I think we should be quite clear about it. As for trauma, I think sometimes traumas are self-imposed. It's interesting that after the Holocaust, almost no Jews did not discuss it. It wasn't prominent at all in Jewish or even Israeli literature. In the first history curriculum in Israel, out of 200 pages, 1 was devoted to the Holocaust and 12 were devoted to the Napoleonic Wars. It was not an issue then, because concern with what happened in the Holocaust was seen as something the communists and the left were all interested in. For instance, at the memorial service for the Rosenbergs who were executed in America, the song of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance was sung. So if you were concerned with the Holocaust, you were seen as a bit of a pinko, to be quite honest. But of course, in the wake of the Kastner trial, which I've mentioned, Israel then decided it would capture Adolf Eichmann and turn that into what was a show trial. In other words, it adopted the narrative of the Holocaust, and Israel was seen as the natural successor of the Holocaust. And that is where all of this stems from. And Israel, if you like, became the future Holocaust victim, as it were, and never again was used as a slogan. Not to say that all racism was wrong, but only that racism against Jewish people was wrong. That's the lesson that Zionism has drawn from the Holocaust. It doesn't draw any universal lessons about how we must oppose all forms of racism, all forms of genocide, and so on. And that is what, if you like, bourgeois history always does. It draws the wrong lessons from historical events, and it's up to us to correct them. So we have all these Holocaust memorial days. So someone like Eric Pickles, Lord Pickles, who funded the eviction of the Dale Farm gypsy site. Remember, gypsies were murdered and exterminated in roughly the same proportions as Jews. He sees no problem with being an anti-gypsy bigot. But of course, he is extremely concerned about anti-Semitism. But he still justifies the Tories sitting in the European Parliament without a fascist and anti-Semite, including Robert Zeil from the Latvian LNNK, Fatherland Freedom Party, who marched every year with the veterans of the Latvian Waffen-SS, who took part in the butchery of the Jews of Riga and elsewhere. This is the hypocrisy that we're faced with.
Absolutely, Tony.
Yeah, great answer, Tony. And but I think it's also incumbent upon us to raise these issues in a matter of free speech, and to talk about these conspiracy theories and like you've just done, address them head on and put people straight on the facts of the matter, and educate people, because people pick up far too many conspiracy theories by watching things on YouTube and other video channels, and I think it does need to be addressed, and your answer was absolutely right there. Van der Kar says, why didn't the Labour Party and Corbyn defend themselves from the Israel lobby? The Al Jazeera documentary was a perfect gift to them to use in their defence, but it was never used to expose what was going on.
It's a very good question. I don't have a terribly good answer for it, because it's difficult for me to get inside the head of Jeremy Corbyn and his fellows. I mean, Corbyn was faced with a hostile Labour Party, which was pro-imperialist. So he adopted the strategy of appeasing those who would not be appeased. And therefore, there were certain areas like Trident, NATO, and so on, that he didn't go into. And when all these attacks on anti-Semitism came about, rather than standing up to them and calling them out for what they were, he assumed they were made in good faith. So, I read the leaked report. You remember the Labour leaked report, and if you remember, it's on page, I think, 306. But you can search for it, where there is a message from Corbyn and his the leader of the opposition office saying to the witch hunters, the compliance unit, we need to speed up the expulsions of Tony Greenstein, Jackie Walker, Ken Livingstone, and Mark Wadsworth, in order that we can rebuild trust with the Jewish community. Leave aside the question of who constitutes the Jewish community and Jewish stakeholders, whoever they are. Well, they did expel us. And did they rebuild trust? Of course not. They came back with more demands and more demands. And eventually, the only demand that was left was the head of Jeremy Corbyn himself. And now he's suspended under the same procedures that he introduced, the fast-track procedures, to deal with what they said was egregious cases. In fact, it's every case to do with anti-Semitism. So it was a catalogue of mistakes. And I blame, first and foremost, people like Seamus Milne. He was a strategic director. He was there to outline a strategy. He was there to sit back and think and make an assessment. Now, it wasn't difficult. When I was suspended, before I was suspended, I was quite wise to what was happening. But after I was suspended, I was absolutely convinced this is an organised campaign. If you like, it's a conspiracy. We don't know exactly who's behind it, but certainly Al Jazeera showed the Israeli embassy. But that was just a snapshot, that film. It didn't show British intelligence involvement. It didn't show American intelligence. We have fragmentary evidence now from what Mike Pompeo said and others, that all of them were involved, and it makes sense that they would be involved as well. But Corbyn never seemed to understand what was happening. He avoided conflict. In the end, he threw his friends overboard and appeased his enemies and ended up in the situation that he was. He should have stood up when Chris was suspended and then reinstated. And you remember Tom Watson organised that petition of 100 or so right-wing MPs and peers. Corbyn should have stood up and said, Chris is no racist. We must accept the decision. And Jenny Formby should have been told what to do. But instead, Corbyn apparently said, what the fuck is happening? Why did they do that? It's unbelievable. But basically, he was eating out of their laps. It's very sad, but that is how it was.
I had a conversation, Tony, with Seamus Milne, and he accepted that anti-Semitism was being weaponized. This was well before, the events that consumed me. But you also mentioned John McDonnell, and John McDonnell's attitude was just one more capitulation, and that'll draw a line under it. He didn't put it like that, but he said, we just do this one more thing, and that'll draw a line under it. Well, and it's like they didn't learn from the light of experience. And I was pleading with the Socialist campaign group and Jeremy to stop apologizing and start standing up for yourself and standing up for the reputation, and, you know, stop these attacks that they're making against, these bad faith attacks against Jeremy's Praetorian Guard. I mean, people like you were Jeremy, and me were Jeremy's Praetorian Guard, and Sean, for that matter, who was also targeted. The three of us on here have all been targeted, and there are many, many others out there. They were all Jeremy's strongest allies: socialists, anti-imperialists, anti-racists. And you mentioned Mark Wadsworth, Mark Wadsworth, who drew attention to the Stephen Lawrence case, introduced Stephen Lawrence family to Nelson Mandela. He was targeted, and I supported him, and we saw the MPs led by Ruth Smith et al. Going along to the disciplinary hearing to try and influence the outcome. It was a shameful affair, and what was really disappointing was the way in which people like John McDonnell and others just simply didn't learn the lesson. I mean, you could maybe make an excuse or accept, they try this approach once or twice, but when you've tried it 4, 5, 6 times, and all that happens is it gets worse, you're gonna think, God, what are you doing?
Corbyn just got into the mindset, and once you go down that road of appeasement, it becomes more and more difficult.
Absolutely. So but the campaign group, though, Tony, as well, the campaign group were equally culpable. They could have made a stand. I mean, I kept saying to them, look, our job as the campaign group isn't to just slavishly agree with every dot and comma, everything that Jeremy ever says. We need to be pushing him to go further, to create the space for Jeremy. And particularly on this issue, they could have done that, but they didn't. And anyway, we've got time for one more question. I know Tony wanted to go in before 8 o'clock. We have not managed to do that, Tony, but we will finish it by 8 o'clock. But one more comment, Sean, from our audience, and then we must let Tony go.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say maybe one day I'll be able to get on and tell my story, because I never got suspended and I was never expelled, I was never excluded from going into any meetings. I have a very traumatic story to tell about the Labour Party and how I was targeted. So yeah, maybe we'll do that one day, Chris. So the last question really is by Sylvia Vouston. She said, how do we get the message out when the media twist everything that we say? This is the big question, I think, on everybody's lips.
Well, we're doing it tonight on Resistance TV, but Tony?
Well, I think that's right. We have to develop our own alternative forms of media, whether it's Resistance TV, whether it's the Word newspaper, whether it's the extremely excellent Canary website or Squawk Box or blogs like my own. We have to try and connect with people because the mass media will not do it for us. And when it came to attacking Corbyn, I mean, there was unanimity about it, in the media, from the Guardian to the Sun. They all sang from the same hymn sheet because they all know at the end of the day they're part of the same system. They may have minor differences and they'll argue those ferociously, but if you stand outside of the system, then you're cut off. And I mean, the Guardian, which I used to have regular letters appearing, but the letters page is now, I say, been Friedlandized. It's also come under the sway of Jonathan Friedland, and it's a no-go area for people who are anti-Zionists. I mean, they have the odd letter in, but the Guardian has changed. I mean, I used to write for Commenters Free, but that's no longer an option. So all debate in papers like the Guardian even has been ended in essence. And we have to face up to the fact that we have to communicate through alternative channels. And of course, social media giants will do their best to inhibit our abilities. We know that. Yes,
indeed. Well, listen, thanks very much indeed, Tony. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, everybody, for watching. It's been another fascinating discussion this evening. Next week, at the same time, we will be speaking to people who have been in attendance at a rally in support of Professor David Miller at Bristol University. And he's been targeted in the way in which Tony, myself, and others have been with this confected, bogus anti-Semitism smear. And we will be getting a reaction from people who attended the rally. It's a crucially important campaign to defend Professor David Miller. If you're not familiar with this campaign, just simply Google it and you'll see that there is a lot of information out there. And this really is important. A real line in the sand must be drawn here. We cannot allow the Zionist lobby to take out Professor David Miller, because that really will be a very, very retrograde step. This, I think, could be the beginning of a fight back, but it's really important that we stand in solidarity with David Miller to actually push back. So thanks again for watching this evening, and hopefully be able to join us next week.